I watched my wife sign the divorce papers with a smile she couldn't quite hide, her pen moving across the settlement agreement, the house, the cars, what she believed was half of everything I owned. And in that moment, watching her perform grief for the mediator while Derek sat in the back of the room doing math in his head, I understood something I had not fully understood before. The most dangerous version of me was the one they were certain didn't exist. They thought I was too nice, too trusting, too conservative, too blind. They were right about all of it, right up until the night I stood in my own hallway and heard them plan my ruin in the bedroom I had paid for. After that, I became something else entirely. James Anderson had always prided himself on being the kind of man who noticed details. It was that precise, methodical mind that had turned a modest software startup into a thriving company, that had kept meticulous records of every contract, every transaction, every offshore account, all perfectly legal, all perfectly organized. It was ironic, then, that the most important detail of his marriage had been hiding in plain sight for what must have been months, perhaps longer, right under the roof of the house he had paid for, in the bedroom he had shared with his wife for 7 years. The discovery came on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, the kind of day so unremarkable that it should not have had the power to reshape a man's entire life. But it did. James had come home early from a business trip, his suitcase barely unpacked from the flight. He had planned it as a surprise, coordinating quietly with Rachel's assistant weeks in advance to ensure she would be home. He had flowers in one hand and champagne in the other, a rare departure from the workaholic routine his wife had been criticizing for months. He remembers the strange normalcy of pulling into the driveway, noticing Rachel's white Mercedes sitting there at 2 in the afternoon. Unusual, but not alarming. Not yet. It was the voices that stopped him cold, coming from the bedroom. 2 of them. One unmistakably Rachel's, low and easy, the way she sounded when she was entirely comfortable with who she was talking to. The other voice hit James like a punch to the chest. Derek Hutchinson, his business partner of 5 years, the man he had built his company alongside, the man he had trusted implicitly with both his professional life and his friendship. James stood motionless in the hallway of his own home, flowers in hand, and listened. What he heard was not a lover's quarrel or a fleeting moment of weakness. It was something far more calculated and far more devastating. Rachel was talking about him the way someone talks about an inconvenient piece of furniture, dismissively, almost bored. She called him boring, obsessed with work, unwilling to take risks or live with any real passion. Derek agreed, enthusiastically, even eagerly, adding that James had been holding the company back with his conservative financial approach, that his caution was becoming a liability. And then came the words that made the blood drain from James's face. Rachel said that once the divorce was finalized and she received her half of the marital assets, they could pool that money to buy James out of his own company at a fraction of what his shares were actually worth. Derek laughed and said James would probably accept whatever number they offered because that was who James was. Too trusting, too naive, too blind to see what was right in front of him. They were, in that moment, completely confident that they had already won. James set the flowers down on the hallway console table. He did not say a word. He did not slam a door or shout or demand answers. He simply turned around, walked back to his car, and drove away. Not in grief, not in shock, but in the strange crystalline calm of a man who has just been handed an enormous and entirely unexpected problem, and who already, somewhere deep in that meticulous, detail-oriented mind, knows exactly how he is going to solve it. James drove for nearly an hour before he stopped, pulling into a mid-range hotel on the edge of the city, the kind of place where no one asked questions and no one recognized you. He paid cash, took his key card, and sat on the edge of the bed in a room that smelled faintly of industrial cleaner and recycled air. He did not cry. He did not call anyone. He did not pour himself a drink or stare blankly at the ceiling the way a man in the movies might after discovering his wife's betrayal. Instead,
James Anderson did what James Anderson had always done when faced with a difficult problem. He opened his mind like a spreadsheet and began to think. For 48 hours, he barely slept. He ordered room service twice, ate mechanically, and spent most of the time pacing, sitting, pacing again. He reviewed everything he knew about his finances with the kind of precision that had made him successful in business. He thought about the offshore accounts, entirely legal, where international contract revenue had been sheltered for years. He thought about the shell companies established for legitimate tax purposes, the consulting agreements structured under separate entities, the patents he had quietly filed under his grandmother's trust 3 years ago when he had first begun to sense that his partnership with Derek was built on shakier ground than he had admitted to himself. He thought about the investments held in that trust, which had quietly tripled in value. And he realized, with a clarity that surprised even him, that Rachel and Derek had made a catastrophic miscalculation. They had assumed that because James appeared to be an open book, he was one. He was not. On the morning of the third day, James picked up his phone and called Mitchell Graves. Mitchell was not the kind of attorney who appeared in advertisements or handed out business cards at charity galas. He was the kind of attorney whose name was passed in whispers between men who had survived very expensive mistakes. He had handled some of the ugliest divorces in the state, and he had never once lost a case he believed in. James laid out everything, what he had heard, what he suspected, and what he wanted to accomplish. Mitchell listened without interrupting, which was itself a form of respect. When James finished, there was a long pause on the line. Then Mitchell said quietly that what James was proposing was brilliant, but that it would require James to do something genuinely difficult. He would have to look like he was losing. He would have to perform defeat so convincingly that Rachel, Derek, and their attorney would never think to look deeper. James considered this for only a moment. He told Mitchell that performing weakness was a small price to pay for the truth. That he had already been weak, weak enough to trust two people who had been planning his financial ruin over pillow talk. He was done with that particular kind of weakness. Now he intended to be something else entirely. Mitchell told him to come in the following morning. They had a great deal of work to do and very little time to do it cleanly. James hung up the phone, looked at himself in the hotel mirror for a long moment, and made himself a quiet, unbreakable promise. They would never see him coming.
An actor's greatest challenge is not playing someone entirely unlike himself. It is playing a diminished version of himself. The same man, stripped of confidence, stripped of power, stripped of everything that makes him formidable. That was the role James Anderson spent the next several weeks perfecting, and he was, by every account, extraordinary in it. He moved out of the family home with minimal protest, taking only what a genuinely devastated man would think to take: a few boxes of clothes, some books, a photograph or two. He left behind the artwork, the furniture, the carefully curated life they had built together, and he did so without visible resistance, which Rachel clearly interpreted as surrender. He rented a modest apartment across town, clean but unremarkable, the kind of place a man ends up in when his world has collapsed around him. He drove the old Honda Civic he had kept from his college years, a car he had maintained out of sentimentality and that now served a far more strategic purpose. He wore clothes that had been sitting in the back of his wardrobe, slightly faded, slightly ill-fitting, the sartorial language of a man who had stopped caring. He let shadows gather under his eyes. He moved through the world with his shoulders slightly rounded and his jaw slightly slack, and when Rachel inevitably saw him, at a mutual friend's gathering, in the parking lot of their old dry cleaner, she looked at him with exactly the expression he needed her to have: relief. Confirmation, the quiet, satisfied certainty that she had already won. Rachel filed for divorce, citing irreconcilable differences, a phrase that in their particular case carried a rich, private irony that James savored alone. She had selected Vivian Cross as her attorney, a choice that told James everything he needed to know about her intentions. Vivian was legendary in legal circles for her ability to reduce men to rubble in divorce proceedings. She was precise, aggressive, and completely without sentiment. She would be looking for blood. So James hired his own attorney carefully, Mitchell's nephew,
a young man who had recently passed the bar and who presented in every meeting and correspondence as earnest but slightly overwhelmed. He fumbled papers. He asked questions that made him seem out of his depth. He occasionally took a moment too long to respond, as though the legal complexities were just slightly beyond his confident grasp. It was a performance as practiced as James's own. Meanwhile, Rachel moved through the process with growing confidence. She posted nothing on social media about the divorce itself. She was too calculated for that. But James could see in her manner during their occasional exchanges that she believed the story she was telling herself, that she was the wronged party, the neglected wife finally claiming what she deserved. Derek, to his credit, stayed mostly out of sight, though James knew through careful observation that the two of them were together constantly, celebrating quietly, planning openly. They were already spending James's money in their imaginations. He let them. Every week that passed in convincing defeat was another week in which Mitchell's team moved assets, restructured holdings, and built walls so clean and legally sound that they would be virtually invisible to even the most aggressive forensic accountant. James played the broken man beautifully, and in the background, unseen and unsuspected, the real James Anderson was already building his future.
The mediation room smelled of fresh coffee and expensive leather, the kind of environment designed to project neutrality while making certain parties feel distinctly at a disadvantage. James arrived in a slightly wrinkled suit, his hair not quite as sharp as it should have been, a man who looked like he had dressed in a hurry and hadn't slept especially well. He took his seat beside Mitchell's nephew, who arranged his folders with the slightly flustered energy of someone managing just a little too much at once. Vivian Cross arrived like a weather system. She was impeccably dressed, utterly composed, and carried herself with the casual authority of someone who had never lost a room in her professional life. She set her materials on the table with practiced precision, and then she smiled at James with the kind of smile that is technically friendly and functionally a threat. Rachel came in behind her, dressed in soft, muted colors, her hair pulled back, her expression arranged into something between sadness and quiet dignity. She had lost a little weight. She looked, James had to admit, genuinely sympathetic, which was the point. The mediator welcomed everyone and invited Vivian to outline her client's position. Vivian did so with brisk, almost bored efficiency. The house, both luxury vehicles, half of James's stake in the company, and $50,000 per month in temporary spousal support until the divorce was finalized. Mitchell's nephew made a sound that was somewhere between a cough and a protest, managing to convey both outrage and inadequacy simultaneously. Vivian turned her smile on him with the patience of a professor addressing a slow student. She said James should have considered the cost of neglecting his wife before the neglect became a legal matter. Rachel produced a single tear. It was, James noted privately, very well timed. He agreed to almost everything. He did not argue about the house. He knew the mortgage situation better than Rachel did. He did not fight over the cars, which were leased and therefore represented liability more than asset. He accepted the support figure with a defeated nod. And then, quietly, almost as an afterthought, he mentioned his grandmother's trust. He said it was the one thing he felt he could not surrender. His voice was low, and he looked at the table when he said it, the way a man looks when he is asking for something he knows he doesn't deserve to receive. He said the trust contained a few bonds and some old stocks, sentimental things, worth perhaps $50,000. He said his grandmother had raised him after his parents' deaths and that the trust was all he had left of her. Rachel looked at Derek, who was seated in the back of the room in the studied posture of a supportive friend. Derek's expression performed a brief, visible calculation and resolved into a shrug. 50,000 against the millions they believed they were claiming elsewhere was not a hill worth dying on. Vivian paused, then agreed. The trust could remain separate. James's young attorney produced documentation confirming the trust's stated value. Vivian reviewed it briefly, satisfied. The agreement took shape around that single, carefully constructed concession. As the session ended and the papers were gathered, Rachel reached over and briefly touched James's arm. She said she hoped they could remain civil. He nodded and looked at her with exactly the right amount of quiet sorrow. Behind his eyes, absolutely nothing moved.
The day the preliminary divorce agreement was signed, the weather was gray and still, the kind of morning that feels suspended between seasons, belonging fully to neither. James sat across from Rachel in a conference room that felt slightly too large for the business being conducted in it, the long table between them functioning as both neutral ground and formal divide. Vivian Cross sat beside Rachel, looking satisfied. Mitchell's nephew sat beside James, looking appropriately overwhelmed. The mediator reviewed the terms one final time with the careful, measured cadence of someone whose job required them to treat every agreement as though it were the first they had ever witnessed. James listened with his hands folded on the table, his expression a careful arrangement of resignation and quiet grief. When the moment came, he picked up the pen with fingers that he had taught himself to make slightly unsteady and signed his name across the settlement document. His signature was smaller than usual. He had practiced that, too. Rachel signed immediately after, and she could not quite suppress it, the faintest lift at the corners of her mouth, a micro-expression that lasted less than a second, but that James, who had been watching for it, caught with perfect clarity. She believed she had won. She believed this completely. Afterward, in the corridor outside the conference room, Rachel approached him. She said she hoped they could still be friends, that despite everything, she didn't want things to be ugly between them. She even hugged him briefly, the kind of hug that carries its own form of condescension, the embrace of someone who believes they are being generous to a defeated opponent. James hugged her back. He could smell Derek's cologne on her jacket. He said nothing about it. He drove back across town in the Honda, changed out of the wrinkled suit, and 40 minutes later walked through an unmarked side entrance of Mitchell Graves' actual office, not the modest storefront space where their staged meetings had taken place, but his real downtown suite, all polished floors and floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, and the particular quiet of a space where consequential things regularly happened. Mitchell was waiting for him. He slid a folder across the desk with the unhurried confidence of a man delivering exactly the news he had promised to deliver. The trust, Mitchell said, had been liquidated that morning. The figure on the page was $4.2 million, already moved to the Cayman holding structure they had spent months building. The software patents filed quietly under his grandmother's name 3 years prior were generating $60,000 per month in licensing revenue, none of which appeared on James's personal tax returns because none of it was required to. The offshore consulting contracts were clean, separate, and airtight. James looked at the numbers on the page for a long moment. He asked Mitchell what Rachel was actually walking away with. Mitchell did the arithmetic on his legal pad. Roughly $200,000 in home equity after the mortgages, the leased vehicles which carried their own liabilities, and approximately $1.8 million in company stock at its current valuation. Roughly $2 million in real assets. Against James's actual net worth of $13.4 million, she had received approximately 15% of what he truly owned and believed she had taken everything. James set the folder down, looked out the window at the city below, and for the first time in months allowed himself to exhale completely. The performance was over. The real work was about to begin.
There is a particular discipline required to keep playing a role after the curtain has already fallen, to continue performing poverty when you are quietly wealthy, to drive the old car and live in the modest apartment not because you must, but because the story is not yet finished and the audience is still watching. James understood this with the patient precision of someone who had spent his entire career thinking 3 moves ahead. So for the first month following the finalized divorce, nothing changed on the surface. He kept the apartment, he kept the Honda, he kept the slightly defeated posture and the brief, wounded text responses when Rachel checked in with her occasional friendly messages, which she continued to send with the breezy confidence of someone who felt she had handled a difficult situation rather well. He read each one and replied in the fewest words possible, always with just enough flatness to suggest a man still processing loss. He never told her he was fine. Fine was not a word that served his purposes. But behind that careful exterior, James was moving fast. The new company had been forming in the background for months, structured entirely through the offshore entities and holding companies that existed well outside the reach of any divorce proceedings or business buyout.
He had identified the market gap with surgical precision. His old company's flagship product had fundamental architectural limitations that he had been quietly aware of for 2 years, but had never raised with Derek, because raising them would have required sharing solutions he had not yet decided to share. Now he was free. He assembled a small elite team, engineers he had worked with years before Derek, people who trusted him personally and whose talent he trusted absolutely. He found office space in a building downtown, a floor with good light and enough room to grow, and he signed the lease under the new company's name. He retrieved his custom suits from the storage unit where they had been waiting and began wearing them again, feeling with each morning the small, precise pleasure of being himself without apology. He bought the Tesla, midnight blue, which seemed appropriate for a man who had spent several months operating in the shadows, and drove it to the new office on the first day with a feeling he could only describe as re-entry. The platform they were building made his old company's product look like a relic. He had known for years what the next generation of this technology needed to do and how to make it do it, and now, with no partner to manage and no board to placate and no cautious consensus to build, he built it the way it needed to be built. The clients began calling within weeks. These were people who had worked with James personally at his former company, who had valued his specific understanding of their problems, and when word reached them through professional channels that he was developing something new, their curiosity was immediate and their enthusiasm rapid. Several of them signed letters of intent before the platform was even complete. James read each one and filed it away without celebration. Celebration would come later. For now, he remained in motion, building, hiring, refining, preparing. He was a man who had been briefly made invisible by circumstance and had used that invisibility to construct something extraordinary. The quiet months were almost over. Very soon, the city would know exactly where James Anderson had gone.
3 months to the day after the divorce was finalized, James Anderson threw a party. Not the loud, aggressive kind of celebration that announces itself to the world with desperation, nothing like that. This was something quieter and more deliberate. Drinks and conversation for 50 people, held in the penthouse he had purchased outright for $2.4 million cash on the top floor of a new glass and steel building that overlooked the river like a statement. The building had caught his attention months earlier, when he had still been driving the Honda and wearing the sad suits and texting Rachel in monosyllables. He had noted it then and filed it away for later, the way he filed everything. Now it was his. The penthouse occupied the entire top floor, 4,000 square feet of open-concept space with floor-to-ceiling windows that gave a 360-degree view of the city. The kitchen looked like it belonged to a serious restaurant. The master suite was larger than his old apartment. He had spent a month furnishing it properly. Substantial furniture in dark wood and clean lines, art from local galleries, a sound system that cost more than most people's vehicles, a wine cellar built into one wall, a home gym installed in what had been designated a storage room. It felt, from the first morning he woke up there to light pouring off the river, like the truest version of a space he had ever occupied. The guests at the party were people who had known the truth throughout, clients who had watched the performance from a distance and admired it, colleagues who had quietly received calls and emails from James during his months of apparent defeat, a few close friends who had kept their silence with impressive discipline. Mitchell Graves arrived looking deeply pleased with himself, which was the only visible sign of satisfaction he ever permitted. His nephew arrived as well, and somewhere in the evening shed the fumbling junior attorney persona entirely, revealing himself as the sharp corporate lawyer he actually was, the one who had been quietly handling James's new company's contracts for months. The new company was the real story being celebrated, though no one said so directly. It had launched faster than even James's most optimistic projections had suggested. The platform he and his team had built was not merely better than his old company's product, it made it look architecturally primitive, a solution designed for problems that the market was already moving past. The clients had come quickly and committed seriously. Letters of intent had become signed contracts. Revenue was already incoming. His old company, meanwhile, was beginning to feel the absence of its real architect in ways that were showing up in client retention numbers and product development timelines. Derek was starting to understand, though not yet fully, what had been holding the company together all those years.
James stood at the window of the penthouse that evening, a glass of very good wine in his hand, the city spread below him in all directions, and felt something he had almost forgotten was available to him: uncomplicated satisfaction. Not triumph over Rachel, not vindication over Derek, simply the clean, private pleasure of a man who had built something real and protected it and was now watching it grow. He raised his glass once, alone at the window, to no one in particular. Then he turned back to his guests and smiled. The message came from Emily, Rachel's younger sister, on a Tuesday morning when James was between meetings. Emily had always been the more grounded of the two sisters. She had been quietly appalled by the affair when she found out, and she had maintained a careful, cautious friendship with James in its aftermath. Her text was brief and direct, which was characteristic of her. Rachel had hired a private investigator. She was convinced James had hidden money. She was talking about going back to court. James read the message twice, set his phone face down on his desk, and allowed himself a single private moment of amusement. Then he texted Emily back, thanked her, told her he was doing well, and returned to his meeting. He had prepared for this. He had prepared for this from the beginning. The call from Vivian Cross came 2 days later. The predatory certainty that had defined our voice during the mediation was gone, replaced by something more careful, more measured, the professional tone of a woman who was obligated to make a call she already suspected was going nowhere. She said her client had concerns about the financial disclosures during the divorce proceedings. She said there was a belief that certain assets may not have been fully represented. James let the silence sit for a long moment before responding. He asked whether Rachel was accusing him of hiding money. Vivian rephrased. He asked whether Vivian was suggesting her own due diligence had been insufficient. The line went quiet in a different way after that. He walked her through the same position calmly and without heat. Everything had been properly disclosed, everything was documented, everything was clean. There was no new asset to discover, only a man who had started a successful business after a difficult divorce, which was not, as far as he was aware, a legal offense. Vivian tried several angles. James closed each one with the same quiet precision he had applied to every other problem in this chapter of his life. She eventually ended the call without achieving anything she had come for. Derek's messages arrived the same week, and they told a story James had been expecting. The voicemails progressed in a clear emotional arc. The first, businesslike, requesting a conversation. The second, more personal, referencing their shared history. The third, barely coherent, the voice of a man watching something he had assumed was permanent dissolve around him. The old company was hemorrhaging clients. Every major account that had stayed through the acquisition of James's shares was now fielding calls from James's new company, and the calls were being answered favorably. Derek had apparently only recently understood the full scope of what the software patents James had controlled actually represented to the company's product roadmap. Without them, without James, without the client relationships that had been built on James's specific reputation and credibility, the company that Derek had been so eager to control was becoming a considerably less interesting asset. His final message asked, almost plaintively, whether they could find a way to work something out. James listened to it once, saved it to a folder he had created for this exact purpose, and blocked the number. He did not feel anger listening to it. He did not feel satisfaction either, not exactly. He felt the particular quiet of a man who had already moved on and is watching others catch up to a reality he has been living in for months.
He spotted her from inside the cafe window. Rachel was parked across the street in the white Mercedes. His old Mercedes, technically, though the lease payments were now entirely her problem, sitting very still with her sunglasses on, facing his building with the careful posture of someone attempting to appear as though they are not doing exactly what they are doing. James watched her for a full minute from his table, his coffee growing slightly cooler in his hand. She had been crying. He could see it from here, the tension in her jaw, the way she sat too rigidly, the glasses she was wearing indoors in overcast weather. He set his cup down, pushed back his chair, and walked out of the cafe and directly across the street. There was no point in pretending he had not seen her. That particular performance was over. She saw him coming when he was halfway across the road, and he watched her freeze, a full-bodied stillness, the kind that belongs to someone caught between the impulse to drive away and the realization that it is already too late. He knocked on her window. She took a moment. Then she rolled it down. He asked whether she was following him. She said she'd just been in the neighborhood. He pointed out, with some precision, that she lived 30 miles from this particular neighborhood. She removed her sunglasses. Her eyes were red. He had not seen her cry genuinely since the early years of their marriage, and he noted with some detachment that it still had the power to register. She asked him where the money had come from. The car, the building, the suit he was wearing. Where had it all come from when he had left the marriage with almost nothing? He told her he had been working, building a business, which was true. She said he had looked so broken in the months after the divorce, so completely defeated. Had it all been an act? He leaned down so their eyes were level through the open window. Then he asked her, quietly but without any real gentleness, whether sleeping with Derek had been an act, whether the plan to buy him out of his own company at a fraction of its value had been an act, whether 7 years of a marriage she had apparently found boring had been an act. Her face went pale in a way that was different from distress. It was the particular pallor of someone who has suddenly understood how much they underestimated the person in front of them. She said she would take him back to court. He told her she was welcome to try, and that if she did, she should be prepared for what he had documented. He told her about the recordings calmly, the way you tell someone about a precaution you took months ago that has since become relevant. He watched her process this. She started crying in earnest then, telling him it had been a mistake, that she had been confused, that Derek's situation was now considerably more difficult than she had anticipated, and perhaps she had been hasty in her conclusions about who James was and what their marriage had been worth. He listened to all of it. Then he told her what was going to happen next. She was going to get in her car, she was going to drive away, and she was going to stop. He walked away before she could respond. She sat in that car for 10 minutes. Then she drove.
The final chapter of a story like this one is not a single dramatic moment. It is an accumulation, a series of ordinary days that are extraordinary only in their quality, their honesty, their clean and uncomplicated texture. James' new company reached a $20 million valuation within a year of launch. Within 2 years, it had doubled. The Fortune 500 contracts came steadily, each one larger than the last, each one a confirmation of what James had known quietly for a long time, that the value he had brought to his old company had always been his, and that it had simply required the right conditions to demonstrate that fact at scale. Derek's company folded 6 months after the divorce. The clients had gone. The patents that had powered the product roadmap were unavailable. The talent had drifted elsewhere, drawn by opportunity or by the particular professional discomfort of working for someone whose authority they had begun to doubt. Derek resurfaced eventually in a mid-level role at a competitor, making a fraction of what he had made during the years when James had been the architecture behind the work. Rachel sold the house at a loss, absorbed the lease termination fees on the cars, and moved into a smaller apartment. Her social media went quiet. No more restaurant check-ins, no more vacation photographs, no more captions about new beginnings and hard-won freedom. Just silence, which James neither monitored nor missed. He met Sarah 14 months after the confrontation in the street. She was a veterinarian with 2 rescue dogs, a 10-year-old Toyota, and absolutely no idea how much money he had. When she eventually found out, months into a relationship that had built itself on dinners and conversations and long walks and the gradual, unforced accumulation of trust, her reaction was to joke that she would need to reconsider her birthday gift budget. James laughed and realized it was the first time in years that someone's response to his wealth had made him laugh. They were married 3 years after the divorce. Small ceremony, family and close friends, the venue simple and elegant rather than grand. Mitchell Graves was his best man. His nephew attended as himself, sharp, confident, fully visible. At the reception, Mitchell told James it had been the most precisely executed divorce strategy he had encountered in 30 years of practice, and that what James had accomplished was a form of art. James shook his head. He said it had not been art. It had been survival. And then it had been clarity. Clarity about what mattered, what he was willing to protect, and what he was willing to release. He looked across the room at Sarah, laughing with her sister, wearing a simple dress and minimal jewelry, completely at ease in a room that was not trying to be more than it was. His grandmother, whose trust had quietly held the architecture of his future, had once told him that money tests everyone it touches. It tests whether people work or coast, whether they give or take, and most essentially, whether the people around them love who they are or love what they can offer. James had failed that test once. He had trusted completely when trust required more discernment. But the failure had been instructive in the way that only the most expensive lessons are, and he had never had cause to repeat it. Late at night, standing at the floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse, with the city spread below him and Sarah's hand in his, he sometimes thought about the moment Rachel had signed those papers with her barely concealed smile. He thought about how certain she had been. He thought about how wrong she was. And then he turned away from the window, back toward the life he had built with such precision and such patience, and he found, quite genuinely, that he had no room left for anything except gratitude.